Welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive. Much debate has been covered over the current research. We receive a lot of data via email through PDFs and thought stoppers. However, the current information would be best read out and for you to debate or look into further. Enjoy. From the Mount of Olives to Armageddon. Birth pains that will deliver the new system. The evening air on the Mount of Olives was thick with the scent of olive blossoms and distant smoke from the Passover sacrifices. The disciples, still trembling from Jesus' devastating prediction that the magnificent temple, that mountain of white stone and gold, would be left without one stone upon another, pulled him aside. They asked the question that has haunted every generation since. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your presence and of the end of the system of things? Jesus did not give them a date. He gave them a diagnostic. He gave them the spiritual equivalent of a triage nurse's checklist for the dying world. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are a beginning of pangs of distress relative to birth pains. He chose that metaphor deliberately. Birth pains, not a single sudden cataclysm, not a bolt of lightning from a clear sky, but labor, a process, a gradual, inexorable tightening that increases in frequency, intensity, and proximity until the moment of delivery arrives. He was telling them that the world would not die in a single gasp, but would groan its way toward a conclusion, each spasm bringing it closer to the final push. For nearly 19 centuries, humanity experienced those birth pains as a slow, grinding ache. The long labor, 1 AD to 1900 AD, from the fall of Jerusalem, in 70 AD to the dawn of the 20th century, the world knew war. It knew it intimately. The legions of Rome marched. The hordes of Attila swept across Europe. The crescent of Islam expanded. The Crusaders butchered their way to Jerusalem. The Mongols razed cities to the ground. The 30 Years' War turned Germany into a charnel house. Napoleon redrew the map of Europe with cannon fire, and the American Civil War pitted brother against brother in rivers of blood. But here is the crucial distinction. These conflicts, however brutal, were contained. They were regional. A peasant in rural China had no knowledge of the 100 Years' War in France. A farmer in Africa felt nothing of the upheavals in Russia. News traveled at the speed of a horse, a ship, or a rumor. The birth pains were real, devastatingly so, but they were spaced apart. Centuries often separated the great convulsions. The rhythm was slow, almost glacial. There was time to rebuild, time to forget. Time to breathe between the contractions. The death tolls were staggering in proportion to the population, but the tempo of conflict was lethargic. A siege could last a year. A campaign could span a decade. The world was vast, and violence, though terrible, was localized. It was the deep, dull ache of early labor, persistent, painful, but survivable. Humanity could endure it because the intervals between crises were long enough to allow for recovery, for hope, for the illusion that the worst had passed. Then, in 1914, the rhythm shattered. The transition, 1914 to the present. It began as a familiar pain, another Balkan squabble, another assassination of a minor royal, another treaty obligation pulling the great powers into a web of mutual destruction. But within weeks, the world realized that something fundamental had shifted. This was not a nation rising against a nation. This was the world rising against itself. For the first time in history, every major power on Earth was drawn into a single conflict. The steamship, the railroad, the telegraph, and the machine gun had shrunk the planet and industrialized death. The war was not fought on a single front, but on every front. The birth pain that began in Sarajevo in 1914 did not end until 11 million military personnel and 7 million civilians lay dead. It was the first global contraction, and it was a doozy. But the pattern that Jesus described, the overlapping, accelerating pains of labor, became terrifyingly clear in the decades that followed. The interval between the first global contraction and the second was only 21 years. In 1939, the pain returned, and this time it was worse. World War II was not merely a sequel, it was an intensification. 60 million dead. Industrial genocide, the firebombing of cities, the atomic bomb. The pain was no longer regional, it was total. Civilian populations were now the primary targets. The famines and earthquakes of Matthew 24 were no longer just natural disasters. They were man-made apocalypses. And the intervals kept shrinking. Korean War, 1950 to 1953, 5 years after World War II ended. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, overlapping with Korea, bleeding into the Cold War. Six-Day War, 1967, Yom Kippur War, 1973. The Middle East becomes a permanent flashpoint. Gulf War, 1990 to 1991. Balkan Wars, 1991 to 2001. Afghanistan, 2001. Iraq, 2003. The contractions are now coming every few years, sometimes overlapping. Syria, Ukraine, Gaza, Yemen, Sudan. The 21st century has seen conflict become a constant, low-grade fever that periodically spikes into a raging temperature. The difference between the two eras is not the existence of war. It is the velocity and the global interconnection. In the first 1,900 years, a war in Europe was a European problem. Today, a conflict in Ukraine affects the price of bread in Egypt and the supply of microchips in Taiwan. A cyber attack in one country can cripple the infrastructure of another. The rumors of wars are no longer intermittent. They are a permanent background hum, broadcast live into our homes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We are no longer in a state of war and peace. We are in a perpetual state of global tension, a long, unbroken contraction that never fully releases. The pattern: birth pains, accelerating toward a climax. This is where the prophecy becomes chillingly precise. Jesus did not say the birth pains would be constant. He said they would be the beginning, the early warning system. The pattern he described is not random. It is a diagnostic. In natural labor, the contractions do not weaken. They strengthen. They do not spread out. They crowd in on one another. They become more frequent, more intense, and more unbearable until they merge into a single, overwhelming pressure that demands a climax. That is precisely what we have witnessed since 1914. The timeline is undeniable. 1914 to 1918, the first global contraction. 1939 to 1945, the second, more intense contraction, 21-year gap. 1945 to 1991, the Cold War, not a cessation of pain, but a long, silent contraction where the entire world held its breath, poised on the brink of nuclear annihilation. 1991 to 2001, a brief, deceptive lull, followed by 9/11 and the global war on terror, a contraction that has never truly ended. 2001 to present, overlapping crises, financial collapses, pandemics, climate shocks, regional wars, refugee waves, geopolitical realignments. The contractions are no longer separate events. They are stacked on top of one another. The gaps between major global crises have shrunk from centuries to decades, to years, to months. We are feeling the transition phase of labor, the point at which the birth pains become so frequent and so intense that the mother can no longer distinguish one from another. The climax is no longer a distant theological abstraction. It is the very next breath on the horizon, and the Bible is unequivocal about what that climax is. The climax. Armageddon. Jesus did not stop with the birth pains. He pointed beyond them to the end of the labor, to the moment when the world's groaning would finally give way to delivery. The Apostle John, in the book of Revelation, pulls back the curtain on that moment. He describes a final gathering of the nations, a last, desperate convulsion of human rebellion against the Creator. He calls it Armageddon, a name that has become synonymous with the end of the world. But here is what most people miss. Armageddon is not a battle between nations. It is not a war of ideology, territory, or resources. It is the final, futile uprising of human pride against the sovereignty of Jehovah God. The nations will gather, not to fight each other, but to fight against God Himself. Revelation 16:14 describes it as a gathering of the kings of the whole inhabited earth, for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. It is the ultimate contraction, the final push, the climax of all history. The birth pains have been leading to this moment all along. Every war, every famine, every earthquake, every rumor of war, they have been the prelude, not the finale. They have been the body's way of saying, something is coming, something is being born. This cannot go on forever. And the pattern of acceleration, the shortening intervals between crises, is the most terrifying mercy God could give. Because it means we are not in an endless cycle. It means history is not a flat loop of meaningless violence. It means we are moving toward something. The rhythm is not random. It is a countdown. The pain is not pointless. It is the pressure of a new creation being forced into existence. The question that remains. The disciples asked for a sign. Jesus gave them a pattern. He told them to watch, to discern the season, to recognize when the contractions were coming faster and closer together. He did not tell them to panic. He told them to be ready, because the climax is not a tragedy for those who are watching. It is a deliverance. The question that hangs over this narrative, the question that should keep every reader awake at night, is not, when will Armageddon come? The question is, if the pattern is real and if the contractions are already merging, then what are you doing with the time you have left? The birth pains are not slowing down. They are accelerating. The world is not getting more peaceful. It is getting more intense. The gaps are closing. The pressure is building. And the climax, the war of the great day of God the Almighty, is no longer a distant prophecy. It is the inevitable conclusion to a pattern that has been playing out in plain sight for over a century. History wasn't random. It was a slow countdown. But the clock started racing in 1914, and we are out of snooze buttons. The contractions are merging. The labor is transitioning. The climax is imminent. The only question left is whether you will be caught in the final convulsion or delivered through it. If you have followed along this far, you show a quality that not very many people possess. Discernment, you can call it critical thinking. It is the ability to listen, or read something and break it down into various parts to make sense of it and weigh up the facts. However, from the information you have just listened to, I would suggest investigating further. The scriptures that are in the Bible is a vast chasm of knowledge that we have to really dig for. But once you find that seam, knowledge flows like a river. Please keep following along with the deep dive as we unearth insights into hidden knowledge. However, we only really learn when we dig ourselves.